So, as we've been following for quite some time, the situation in Northern Ireland does not look good, with the DUP continuing to cause crisis after crisis after crisis, basically until they get their way. And I have laid out this very well. For some reason, the Conservatives in the Conservative Party are really not listening to what the DUP is saying. But the DUP have been more than clear about what they want and their approach, and that they are not going to give up until they get their way. So, what do they want? Well, they want the current border in the Irish Sea, which makes up the Northern Ireland Protocol, gone completely. They do not want that sea border there. And as far as they are concerned, they are quite happy to cause all this, this current crisis and just keep on rolling until that is gone. And why are they doing this? Well, they were very, very much encouraged by the ERG, by the hard and ultra core Brexiteers in the Conservative Party, under certainly when Theresa May was there, to get rid of her backstop. And then, of course, along comes Boris with his oven ready Brexit deal, to which they then just threw the DUP completely under the bus with. And now the DUP are quite happy to use the exact same tactics that they learned from the ERG to start causing chaos until they get their way. So the situation in Northern Ireland, even though it could be potentially headed to another election, is not going to solve this problem anytime soon. So today we go over to Flinian. I think it is Flinian. Is it Flinian? Yeah, Flinton. Flinton O'Toole, who has been one of the fantastic writers over in Ireland, who has been really sort of covering sort of the Brexit consequences on this. So we're going to have a look at what he's had to say about this situation, because, like I say, this situation ain't going to end anytime soon. But before we get on to that, please do remember to have a look at the please remember to hit the like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help and support the channel. So, over to this today from The Guardian with the title of Northern Ireland Faces Another Pointless Election Thanks to London's Brexit Mess. Last week, amid all the turmoil in the Tory party, there was a brief flurry of interest in the emergence of a cabinet for Prime Minister for the man that more of the British reporters referred to as the Northern Ireland Secretary, Brandon Lewis. Lewis was not the Northern Ireland Secretary. He wasn't even the previous holder of the title of office. He was the one before that. Likewise, when Rishi Sunak was eventually selected, at least one distinguished British commentator proclaimed that the first person of Asian heritage to become Prime Minister of a European country, actually the first leader was Leo Varadkar, who became Taoiseach in Dublin 5 years ago. These are minor slips, and all of these are eager to forgive when political events are following the very vintage logic of the fever dream. But they do serve as a reminder to the so-called border down the Irish Sea is not just a trade barrier. There is a huge haze of psychological detachment. Keeping track of who's in office in Dublin and Belfast is not. For most people in England, all that is all that important. Thus, when the actual Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Hilton Harris, the seventh since the Brexit referendum, was announced on Friday that he is calling a new election of the dissolved assembly, his decision is scarcely even registered above a 0 on the Richter scale in Westminster. A very small earthquake in Belfast, and not many dead. But who really cares that the election will fit precisely Ambrose Bierce's definition of a road as a path along which one may pass from where it is too tiresome to one where it is futile to go? Politics in Northern Ireland are tiresome enough without this exercise in electoral futility. No one expects the outcome to be any slightly different to that one of the Assembly elections last May, and no one believes the Democratic Unionist Party, will have any incentive in this tribalistic atmosphere for a new election to even soften its insecure stance that it will not allow the Assembly to function or even the executive to be formed until the Northern Ireland Protocol of the Brexit Withdrawal Agreement is scrapped. And unless something else happens, they will all be back again in the same frigid halls of Stormont, just uh, beg-pecked, perhaps to the brawls of to the balls of holly, and but with no Christmas cheer to even lighten this political gloom. And that is a really stark situation of the situation. The DUP have no intention of going back until they get their way over Brexit. We've been covering this since you know, this whole started, and they are very, very clear. They even put it out in their 7 tests that they functionally said, we do not want a border in the sea. That has to go. So they have very clearly laid out their position on this. And unfortunately, no one in the Conservative Party seems to be really paying attention to this, which is all the more worrying. But then again, those who did, in even Steve Baker, thinks that it's more about the fact that the DUP came in second. And it's not. They have labelled it very, very clear. It is about the Northern Ireland Protocol. So just as sort of, the ERG threw the DUP under the bus, I think this is very, very much the DUP just getting their revenge on not only the ERG, but the Conservative Party. But yeah, I can say I don't see this ending anytime soon. And, it's not going to, it's going to just continue. This is a complete roundabout again. We will be here after this election. I don't think they're going to elect another speaker either. So we'll be back here again in another couple of years, in another couple of months. But anyway, back to it. Perhaps then, there really is no reason why anyone on the eastern shores of the Irish Sea would be bothered by it at all, except that the very pointlessness of the election does make a bigger point. For what is going on is the theatre of the absurd is another episode of the Brexit show. The collapse of the Northern Ireland's political institutions, the breakdown of international agreements envisaged by the Good Friday Agreement are the predictable consequences of the DUP's crazy zeal for a hard Brexit. Northern Ireland has often been the place where the detritus of British politics, often the sectarian attitudes of old colonial habits of mind, washes up and lingers. Now that is happening again with Brexit. The Great Revolution of 2016 has become almost unspeakable in British politics, and Boris Johnson's boosterism and babble is silenced. Keir Starmer has exorcised the B word from his vocabulary, and there is a deep desire not to talk about it. But Northern Ireland is where these political effects are unavoidable. At the very heart of this political crisis in Northern Ireland is the DUP's inability to take responsibility for the effects of its passionate embrace of the Brexit ultras in London. The DUP gave birth to the protocol. Its horror is the repugnance at its face to face its own child. And it is weird reality that makes Northern Ireland currently ungovernable, either under the agreements agreed in 1998. There were, and are still, only 3 ways to deal with the consequences of Northern Ireland being forged. Against the will of the people, out of the EU, one is a hard border on the island of Ireland, which is unacceptable. The second is what Theresa May ended up with, the infamous backstop. Or the UK would in effect remain in the single market and custom union, thus avoiding the emergence of different trading regimes on the sides of the Irish Sea. The DUP got this outcome from May, but the party rewarded her by helping her to bring her down and put Boris Johnson in power. And because of this insanity, there was only one remaining possibility: a so-called border down the Irish Sea. The DUP hates it, and from a unionist perspective, it is quite right to do so. But by helping to bring down May, it made the entirety inevitable. Thus, of course, it can never admit it. It is left to rail against its own creation and to use the only power it has, which is to paralyze politics in Northern Ireland. Instead of calling a perpetually useless election, the British government has to face its own responsibilities in all this. By threatening to tear up the protocol and hence the resume from the resume from the withdrawal agreement, It has merely encouraged the DUP to believe that its historic error can be washed away. It is, in effect, suggesting that the unfortunate people of Northern Ireland can solve the mess of Brexit by voting in another useless election. But can Rishi Sunak actually face down the Brexit ultras and recommits himself to obeying international law and engages in proper negotiations with the EU to make the protocol work better? It is the first test of whether he can actually make Britain a serious country again. And yeah, it is exactly right. We are in a really bad situation, with this. And it really does come down to you've got to face the consequences of Brexit. The DUP has to come to terms that it wanted this hard Brexit. But remember, most of Northern Ireland voted against Brexit. It and tried to embrace the compromise of Theresa May with the Irish backstop, which was meant all of the UK would remain in the same regulatory orbit of the single market and customs union. But it then joined up with the ERG to throw her out, which would eventually end up with the border in the Irish Sea, which was what many in the the Brexit ultras were talking about. But they joined in on the conversation, the insane conversation of the idea that, oh, don't worry, we'll pass Johnson's absolutely awful, ready-made, oven-ready Brexit deal, and then it won't matter because we can change it however we want down the line. That was why you had David Frost continually threatening to trigger Article 16, but Boris Johnson just wouldn't let him do it. Now, Liz Truss, if she had stayed in power, she might have generally triggered Article 16. She might have generally done that and just gone into a trade war with the EU. Will Rishi Sunak? I think he's at least a bit more sensible than that. But he has to face down the Brexit ultras. If he cannot, then the consequences of Brexit to the people of Northern Ireland, which I have said many times when we discussed this, with the DUP basically refusing to let there be a government in Northern Ireland, especially when you've got a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, and so many other things happening. It is not fair to the people of Northern Ireland not to have a functioning government and for the DUP to basically hold that hostage because they cannot face up to the child in which they themselves birthed. So, as always, like I say, thank you very much for watching, and please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button, and of course, we'll see you all next time.